The teller's face went white. Not gradually, instantly. The way a screen goes white when the system crashes and the display empties and the machine needs a moment to figure out what just happened. She was 29 years old. Her name tag said Blythe. She had been typing my account number into her terminal with the efficient boredom of a person who closes savings accounts 40 times a week and has never once found anything in one that made her stop breathing. She stopped breathing. "Mr. Crew, I need to get my manager." "Is something wrong? Is the account closed?" "No, sir. The account is very much open. I need to get my manager." She stood up, walked to the back office, came back 90 seconds later with a man named Rhett Bocanegra, 44, branch manager, who sat down at the terminal, looked at the screen, and then looked at me with the expression of a man who has just found a Rembrandt in someone's garage. "Mr. Crew, are you aware that this account has an automatic stock purchase plan attached to it?" "A what?" "An automatic stock purchase plan. It was set up in 1985 by the account signatory, Ezra Crew." "That's my father. He's been dead for 24 years. The plan was active for 40 years, Mr. Crew. It purchased shares of a company every month from September 1985 until March 2025. "What company?" He turned the monitor toward me, and I saw the name of the stock that my father had been buying, quietly, for 3 years before I was old enough to understand, and that my mother had continued buying for 23 years after he died, and that had been sitting in a savings account at Norfolk Federal Credit Union in my name for 40 years, while I mopped floors and chopped onions and built an empire for a man who never gave either of us what he promised. Fontaine Hospitality Group, the company I had just been fired from, the company my father helped build, the company that told me 2 weeks ago that I was too old. I was looking at 300,000 shares of the company that had thrown me away, and the shares were worth $12.8 million, and the man who bought them was my dead father. And the reason he bought them was written in 40 years of $25 monthly transactions that said, louder than any words, "If they won't give me what I earned, I'll buy it myself." But before I tell you what I did with 300,000 shares and a dead man's grudge, I need to tell you about the man who started buying and the man who fired me, and the 20 years between them that I spent standing in the background of photographs while someone else held the scissors. My name is Harland Crew. I was 55 years old on March 17, 2026, when I walked into Norfolk Federal Credit Union to close a childhood savings account, and walked out as one of the largest individual shareholders of the restaurant group that had fired me 2 weeks earlier. My father was Ezra Crew. He was the original head chef at Fontaine's on the Chesapeake, a waterfront seafood restaurant in Virginia Beach that opened in 1982. Ezra didn't just cook at Fontaine's. Ezra was Fontaine's. The menu that people lined up for, the recipes that food critics wrote about, the she crab soup that a Washington Post reviewer called the best reason to drive to Virginia Beach, all of it came from Ezra's hands. I grew up in those hands. Not metaphorically, literally. My earliest memories are of standing on a milk crate next to my father at the kitchen counter of our house in Norfolk, watching him test recipes at 6 a.m. before his shift. He would hand me a spoon. "Taste this, Harland. Tell me what's missing." I was 6 years old. I didn't know what was missing. But I tasted it and I said something. More salt, or it's too thick, or I don't like it. And he would nod, the serious nod of a man who was treating his 6-year-old's opinion as professional feedback, and he would adjust. He taught me that food is a conversation, that a recipe is not a formula. It's a relationship between the cook and the person eating. He taught me to respect ingredients the way a carpenter respects wood, understanding the grain, working with the material, never forcing something to be what it isn't. He taught me that kitchens are the most honest rooms in any building, because the food doesn't lie. You can lie in a boardroom, you can lie in a press conference, you cannot lie in a bowl of soup. The soup tells the truth every time. Ezra worked at Fontaine's from 1982 to 1998, 16 years. He was loyal in the way that craftsmen are loyal, not to the man who signs the paycheck, but to the work itself. The kitchen was his studio. The menu was his canvas. And Niles Fontaine, the owner, the front-of-house man, the handshake and the smile, was the gallery owner who hung the paintings and charged admission and put his own name on the building. Niles promised Ezra equity. I know this because I was 13 years old and sitting at the kitchen table doing homework when my father came home from a meeting with Niles in 1984 and told my mother, "He said someday I'll have a piece of it. Someday, Dorotha." He looked me in the eye and said it. My mother, Doretha Crew, was a practical woman. She looked at my father the way practical women look at men who have been promised things by other men. Someday is not a date, Ezra. He meant it. Then get it in writing. He never got it in writing, and someday never came. In 1998, when Niles began the expansion, turning one restaurant into a chain, hiring corporate staff, bringing in consultants and investors, he replaced Ezra with a younger chef named Devin Lark, who had television appeal and a culinary school pedigree. Devin's food was not better than Ezra's. Devin's food was photographable. And in 1998, when the Food Network was beginning to make celebrities out of chefs, photographable was more valuable than perfect. Ezra was pushed out. 16 years, no equity, no ownership stake, no piece of this. Niles shook his hand in the parking lot and said, "Thank you for everything, Ezra. You built something special here." My father drove home. He sat at the kitchen table, the same table where he had tested recipes at 6 a.m. for 16 years, and he told my mother he thanked me for building something special, and then he kept it. Doretha looked at him, and she said the sentence that I believe changed everything that followed. Then build something of your own. I don't know exactly when my father started buying the stock. I know from the transaction records that the first purchase was September 14, 1985, 3 years after he started at Fontaine's, 13 years before he was pushed out, which means Ezra didn't wait for Niles to break the promise. He started building his own position before the promise was broken. He saw it coming. He knew, with the intuition of a man who understands that someday, from a man like Niles Fontaine, is a holding pattern, not a destination, that the equity was never going to arrive. So he went to the credit union on Military Highway, opened a savings account in his 14-year-old son's name, deposited $500, and attached an automatic stock purchase plan. 50 cents a share, $25 a month. Fontaine Hospitality Group. He never told me. He never told anyone except my mother. The account was in my name because Ezra was an employee of Fontaine's. If his name appeared on a shareholder registry, Niles might see it. But a 14-year-old's savings account at a credit union in Norfolk? Nobody checks that. Nobody looks at the financial instruments of teenagers. My father was not a sophisticated investor. He was a chef who made $34,000 a year in 1985. But he understood one thing about Fontaine's that Niles Fontaine himself probably didn't understand at the time. The food was extraordinary. The food was the kind of food that makes people drive 90 minutes, wait 45 minutes for a table and tell their friends about it for weeks. And a restaurant with that kind of food, run by a man with Niles' ambition, was going to grow. Maybe slowly. Maybe into 2 locations, then 5, then 10. But it was going to grow. Because the food was the engine. And Ezra knew the engine was built to last because he had built it himself. $25 a month. For 13 years while he worked at Fontaine's. For 4 more years after Niles pushed him out. And then Ezra died. He died in 2002. Heart attack. He was 63 years old. He died at our kitchen table, the same table where he had tested recipes and received broken promises. My mother called me at work. I was 31, working as a sous chef at a hotel in Norfolk. I drove home. The paramedics were already there. My father was on the floor beside the table. The chair was knocked over. His reading glasses were on the table next to a copy of the Norfolk Virginian Pilot, open to the food section. I buried my father on a Thursday. The funeral was attended by 43 people, most of them restaurant industry, cooks, servers, kitchen managers who had trained under Ezra at Fontaine's in the 1980s and 1990s. Niles Fontaine did not attend. He sent flowers. A generic arrangement from a florist on Atlantic Avenue with a card that said, "With deepest sympathy, the Fontaine family." Not even a handwritten note. A printed card for the man who built his menu. My mother continued the $25 monthly purchases after Ezra died. She maintained a small checking account at the credit union specifically for this purpose. $25 transferred automatically on the 14th of every month, the anniversary of the first deposit. She did this for 23 years. She never told me. She never wavered. She never missed a payment. Doretha died in January 2025 at age 82. I was 54. I was working at Fontaine's. I had been working there for 19 years by then, having joined the company in 2006, 3 years after my father's death, because the restaurant industry was the only industry I knew, and Fontaine's was the biggest operation in the region. I arrived 40 minutes late to my mother's funeral. I was in Raleigh, North Carolina. overseeing the opening of Fontaine's 32nd location. The traffic on I-85 was backed up for 11 miles outside of Durham. I called Niles from the car and told him I needed to leave the opening. "Can't someone else handle the funeral arrangements, Harland? We're 3 hours from service and the walk-in cooler is reading 4 degrees high." "Niles, it's my mother's funeral." "I understand, but this is an opening. You can be at the cemetery by 3 if you leave now." I left. I drove 4 hours. I arrived at the cemetery at 2:47 p.m. The service had started at 2 o'clock. My mother was already in the ground by the time I parked. My cousin Della was standing by the grave, holding a program, and she looked at me with the expression of a woman who wanted to say something about my absence but was too kind to say it at a funeral. "I'm sorry, Della." "She knew you'd be working, Harland. She always knew." Doretha knew. Because Doretha had watched Ezra work 60-hour weeks for Niles Fontaine for 16 years, and then she watched her son do the same thing for 20 years, and the pattern was so familiar that she could predict its outcomes the way a meteorologist predicts weather. Not because she controlled it, but because she had seen it enough times to know what was coming. What was coming was March 3rd, 2026, 2 months after my mother's funeral. The day Niles Fontaine called me into his office with 34 ribbon-cutting photographs on the wall and told me I was too old. I had been at Fontaine's for 20 years. I started in 2006 as a line cook at the original restaurant, the same kitchen where my father had worked, the same station where he had developed the recipes, the same walk-in cooler where he had stored the ingredients that became the foundation of a 34-restaurant empire. I started as a line cook because I wanted to. I could have come in at a higher level. I had 15 years of kitchen experience by then, including 5 years as a sous chef at the Norfolk Marriott. But I wanted to start where my father started, at the line, in the kitchen, with the food. I was promoted to kitchen manager within 18 months, regional operations manager by 2012, VP of operations by 2016. Each promotion was earned with the particular currency that restaurant operations require. Not innovation, not vision, but execution. I was the man who made things work. The supply chain, the inventory protocols, the quality standards, the training programs for kitchen managers at 34 locations. I built the systems that allowed Niles Fontaine to open restaurants the way other men open envelopes, efficiently, repeatedly, without thinking about the mechanics. Niles didn't think about the mechanics because I handled the mechanics. He thought about the brand, the interviews, the magazine profiles, the Food Network appearances where he stood in a kitchen he hadn't cooked in since 2003 and talked about my passion for food, while a camera crew captured him pretending to taste a sauce that Ezra Crew had perfected in 1983. I was in the background of every ribbon-cutting photograph, 34 of them. I counted once during a particularly long budget meeting because the photographs were on the wall and the meeting was boring, and I wanted to see if I was in all of them. I was. 34 photographs, 34 openings. In every single one, Niles was in front with the scissors, and I was behind him in kitchen whites holding a clipboard, making sure the building was ready for the man with the scissors. On March 3rd, 2026, Niles sat across from me in his office and said the words, "Harland, I'm going to be direct. We're restructuring. The board wants younger leadership in operations." "I built the operations, Niles." "I know, and we're grateful. But the industry is evolving." "What board? You own 71% of the company. There's no board decision you don't approve." "Harland, you're 55 years old. The operations VP at Marriott is 38. The ops chief at Darden is 41. The industry is getting younger. You're firing me because I'm too old. I'm restructuring because the market demands it. That's the same sentence with a suit on, Niles." He offered 8 weeks of severance, $17,200 before taxes, 20 years of building 34 restaurants, and the exit package was less than what the company spent on a single weekend's seafood delivery. I signed the non-compete, a clause prohibiting me from working for any restaurant within a 100-mile radius for 12 months. I signed it because I had no leverage. I didn't know about the shares yet. I cleaned out my desk. 20 years in a cardboard box. Photographs from openings where I stood behind Niles. Menus I had developed that bore his name. A training manual I had written in 2014 that was still the operational Bible for all 34 locations. 127 pages of procedures, standards, and protocols with Fontaine Hospitality Group on the cover and no mention of the man who wrote it. And a coffee mug that said, "Fontaine's, 20 years of service, with my name misspelled on the back. Harlan. 20 years and they couldn't spell my name. I drove home to Norfolk in the Ford Ranger. 1-bedroom apartment on Granby Street. $1,400 a month. I sat on the couch and I looked at the wall and I counted my assets. $2,300 in checking, $17,200 in severance coming, a truck with 194,000 miles, a non-compete that meant I couldn't cook within 100 miles, and a cardboard box with a misspelled coffee mug. For 2 weeks, I applied for jobs outside the restaurant industry, logistics, supply chain, operations management. The skills are transferable. Running 34 restaurant kitchens is not conceptually different from running a distribution warehouse, but every application asked for the same thing: your most recent employer and reason for departure. And the answers, Fontaine Hospitality Group and restructured, carried the silent subtext that HR managers could read the way chefs read a recipe. He was fired, and at 55, he's probably not going to be hired again. By March 17th, I was desperate enough to look for money in places I hadn't looked in 40 years, which is how I ended up at Norfolk Federal Credit Union, asking to close a savings account that I had been told about once at age 14 and had never thought about again. My father had mentioned it. Once, in 1985. I opened an account for you at the credit union. There's $500 in it. Don't touch it until you need it. I was 14. I didn't ask questions. I didn't think about it again for 40 years. And now, at 55, broke, fired, and sitting across from a branch manager whose eyebrows were approaching his hairline, I was learning that the $500 my father deposited when I was a teenager had been doing something for 40 years that nobody told me about. Mr. Crew, your account currently holds 300,000 shares of Fontaine Hospitality Group. Rhett explained the mechanics. The initial $500 bought 1,000 shares at 50 cents each. The automatic purchase plan added 50 shares per month for 40 years, 24,000 additional shares. 3 stock splits, 2-to-1 in 1999, 2-to-1 in 2008, 3-to-1 in 2018, multiplied the total by 12. 25,000 pre-split shares times 12 equals 300,000 shares. Current stock price, $42.75. 300,000 times $42.75 equals $12,000,000 to $825,000. He printed the transaction history, 40 pages, one for each year. Each page showing $12.25 purchases, steady as a heartbeat, from September 1985 to March 2025. I held those pages the way you hold a letter from someone who is dead, carefully, with both hands, because the paper is the last physical connection to a person who can no longer speak, and the transactions written on it are the closest thing to a conversation you will ever have with them again. Each line was a $25 purchase. Each purchase was a statement, and the statement, repeated 480 times over 40 years, was, "You owe me, Niles Fontaine. And since you won't pay, I'll take it myself." I drove home from the credit union with the printed statement on the passenger seat of the Ford Ranger. $12.8 million, documented on 40 pages, riding shotgun in a truck with 194,000 miles. I parked in front of my apartment on Granby Street. I sat in the truck for 45 minutes. I did not call anyone. I did not celebrate. I sat with the information the way my father would have sat with it. Quietly, patiently, letting the weight of it settle before deciding what to do with it. What I did was call a securities attorney the next morning. Corinna Pratt, 52 years old, partner at a Richmond firm specializing in corporate and securities law. I told her the situation. She asked me to drive to Richmond with the documents. I drove the next day. She reviewed the account, verified the shares, confirmed the splits, and looked at me across her desk with the particular focus of an attorney who has just identified a case that will define her quarter. With 300,000 shares, you hold approximately 4.2% of Fontaine Hospitality Group. That makes you the largest individual shareholder outside of Niles Fontaine himself. What can I do with 4.2%? Everything that matters. Vote, attend shareholder meetings, propose resolutions, request board representation, access financial documents, and if corporate governance has been violated, which based on what you're telling me about your termination it may have been, you have standing to challenge it. What about the firing? A separate lawsuit. You're too old is textbook ADEA. We're filing that immediately. But the shares give you something the ADEA claim doesn't, leverage inside the company. An age discrimination lawsuit threatens them from outside. A 4.2% shareholder threatens them from inside. Together, they create a pressure that Niles Fontaine has never experienced, because Niles Fontaine has never had to deal with a shareholder who also knows where the bodies are buried. I know where everything is buried. I built the graves. Then let's start digging. We spent 2 months preparing. Corinna and I reviewed Fontaine Hospitality's public filings, board structure, compensation disclosures, and governance policies. I provided insider knowledge, not confidential information. Corinna was careful about the line, but the operational context that allowed her to read the filings the way a chef reads a menu, understanding not just what's listed but what's missing. What was missing was accountability. Niles had run the company as a personal fiefdom for 44 years. The board consisted of 3 members: Niles, his wife Genevieve, and his attorney. Minority shareholders had no representation. Executive compensation disclosures were minimal, and the company's governance policies hadn't been updated since 2009. We identified 3 proposals for the annual shareholder meeting, each one designed to address a different failure, each one designed to force Niles Fontaine to answer in public for decisions he had been making in private for 4 decades. The annual shareholder meeting was May 15, 2026, Virginia Beach Convention Center. I drove the Ford Ranger, parked it between a Mercedes and a BMW in the shareholder parking section, proof of ownership required, and my proof was 300,000 shares and a printed statement from Norfolk Federal Credit Union. I walked in wearing a suit. Navy blue, off the rack, fitted the previous week by a tailor on Colley Avenue named Mr. Naranjo, who had been altering suits in Norfolk for 31 years, and who asked me what the occasion was. Shareholder meeting. What company? The one that fired me. He looked at me. The look of a man who has fitted suits for weddings and funerals and job interviews and has never once fitted a suit for revenge. He adjusted the shoulders, took in the waist, and when I asked what I owed, he said, "Nothing? A man going to war needs his armor to fit. This one's on me." I signed in at the registration desk. The woman at the desk checked my name against the shareholder. Registry. Harland Crew, 300,000 shares. Welcome, Mr. Crew. She said it at normal volume, but 2 Fontaine executives standing 6 feet away heard it. I knew both of them, Devin Whitaker and Priya Samuels, junior operations managers I had hired and trained in 2018 and 2019 respectively. They were wearing tailored suits and attending their first shareholder meeting, and the man who had trained them was standing at the registration desk with a number that made both of them turn around and look at each other with the expression of people who are witnessing something they will tell their children about. I took a seat in the 3rd row, center, the kind of seat I had never occupied at Fontaine's. I was always in the back, in the kitchen, behind the line, behind Niles. Today, I was in the 3rd row, and Niles was at the podium, and the distance between us was 12 feet instead of 20 years of hierarchy. Niles gave the annual address. Revenue up 14%. 4 new locations planned for the fall. The Fontaine brand was strong, the customer satisfaction scores were at an all-time high, the future was bright. He spoke the way he always spoke, with the smooth, rehearsed confidence of a man who has been telling a story about himself for so long that he has forgotten who helped write it. He used the word "I" 14 times in his opening remarks. He used the word "team" twice. I counted. He did not mention Ezra Crew. He did not mention the original menu. He did not mention the head chef who developed the recipes that 34 restaurants still serve. He did not mention me. He mentioned our incredible operations infrastructure, without naming the man who built it. The floor opened for shareholder questions. I raised my hand. Niles saw me. I watched the recognition travel across his face, and not just the face, but the context. Harland Crew, fired 2 months ago, sitting in the 3rd row, in a suit with his hand raised, at a shareholder meeting. Yes, Mr. Crew. I stood. The room adjusted. 80 people, most of whom had never seen me, turning toward a man in a navy suit who was about to rearrange their understanding of the company they had invested in. Thank you, Mr. Fontaine. For the record, my name is Harland Crew. I hold 300,000 shares of Fontaine Hospitality Group, approximately 4.2% of the company. I believe that makes me the largest individual shareholder in this room other than yourself. The number landed. I could see it landing, in the faces of the institutional investors, in the posture of the board members, in the sudden stillness of Niles's hands on the podium. I worked for this company for 20 years. I was your VP of operations. I oversaw the expansion from 1 restaurant to 34. I trained every kitchen manager in the system. I built the supply chain, the inventory protocols, and the quality standards that produced the 14% revenue growth you just presented. 2 months ago, you fired me and told me I was too old. Niles gripped the podium. The knuckles went white. The room went quieter. My shares were purchased beginning in 1985 by my father, Ezra Crew. Some of you may not recognize that name. Ezra Crew was the original head chef of Fontaine's on the Chesapeake. He developed the menu that every one of your 34 restaurants still serves. The crab cakes, the oyster stew, the blackened rockfish, the she-crab soup that a Washington Post reviewer called the best reason to drive to Virginia Beach. All Ezra. He worked here for 16 years. He was promised equity by Mr. Fontaine. He never received it. I looked at Niles. He was not moving. His hands were on the podium, and they were not moving because if he let go, the room would see them shake. So, my father bought it himself. 50 cents a share, $25 a month. Through a savings account in my name at a credit union in Norfolk. For 40 years, 13 years while he worked here, 4 more after he was pushed out, and then my mother continued the purchases for 23 years after my father died. 40 years of $25 purchases, while I worked 60-hour weeks building the company my father was quietly buying. I paused. Not for drama, because the next part was the part that mattered, and I wanted the room to be ready. As a shareholder, I have 3 proposals. First, I am requesting a formal review of the company's age discrimination policies in light of my termination and the ADEA lawsuit that has been filed on my behalf. Mr. Fontaine told me I was too old for this company. I'd like the board to define what that means. Second, I am requesting board representation for minority shareholders. This company has denied minority shareholder representation for 15 years. I am proposing that a seat be created, and I am nominating myself. Third, I am proposing a resolution to rename the original restaurant, Fontaine's on the Chesapeake, to Crew's on the Chesapeake, in recognition of the man whose recipes you've been serving for 43 years without acknowledgement, the man you promised equity and never delivered, the man whose son you fired for being too old. The room was silent. Not the polite silence of a corporate meeting, the loaded silence of a room where something has shifted and everyone is calculating what it means. You told me I was too old, Niles, but I'm not too old to vote 300,000 shares, and I'm not too old to remind this room that the Fontaine name is on the building, but the Fontaine food came from a Crew. I sat down. The room exhaled. And then something happened that I had not expected. One of the institutional investors, a woman representing a pension fund that held 3% of the company, started clapping. Not loudly, but steadily. And within 4 seconds, 11 other people in the room were clapping with her. Niles stood at the podium through the applause. His face was composed, the same face he had worn for 44 years of magazine covers and television appearances. But underneath the composition, the architecture was cracking, the way buildings crack when the foundation shifts. The votes were taken that afternoon. The age discrimination policy review passed. Institutional investors voted unanimously in favor because opposing an anti-discrimination measure is a PR liability that no fund manager wants in their portfolio. The board representation proposal passed. Same logic, amplified by the applause. I was elected as minority shareholder representative to the Fontaine Hospitality Group Board of Directors. The restaurant renaming did not pass. Niles used his 71% majority to block it. The original Fontaine's on the Chesapeake will remain Fontaine's. For now. I am not in a hurry. The Crews are not people who hurry. We are people who buy $25 of stock every month for 40 years and let time do the work. The ADA lawsuit settled in June 2026 for $1.4 million. Fontaine's insurer paid rather than risk a trial with Niles's documented "you're too old" statement. The settlement included a non-disparagement clause. Niles cannot publicly criticize me, and I cannot publicly criticize Niles. But the shareholder meeting speech happened before the settlement was signed, which means every word I said is on the public record and in the meeting transcript that every shareholder received. The local newspaper in Virginia Beach ran the story the week after the meeting. Fired VP reveals $12.8 million stake in company stock. Demands restaurant named after father. The reporter, a woman named Karis Blount, who covered the food industry beat, called me for a quote. I gave her one. My father was promised a piece of the company he helped build. He never received it. So he bought it himself. $25 at a time, for 40 years. I am his son, and I am continuing what he started, not with $25 a month, but with a board seat and a vote. The story went regional within a week, then national, through food industry media and business press. The story people shared was not about the $12.8 million. It was about the $25. $25 a month. The chef who was promised equity and bought it himself, one share at a time. It is July 2026 now. 4 months since the credit union. 3 months since the shareholder meeting. I sit on the board of Fontaine Hospitality Group. I attend quarterly meetings in the same building where I was fired. The first board meeting was in June. I walked into the conference room, the same conference room where Niles had fired me 3 months earlier, and I sat down at the table. The same table, different chair. The chair at the end where Niles had sat me in March when he told me I was too old. Now I sat there as a board member. Same chair, different gravity. Niles was across the table. We did not shake hands. We did not make small talk. He opened the meeting. I took notes. The meeting covered Q2, projections, new location construction timelines, and a proposed menu update for the fall season. When the menu update came up, I spoke for the first time. The proposed changes to the she crab soup base, the substitution of canned crab for fresh, would reduce cost by 40 cents per serving. It would also destroy the recipe that has been the signature dish of this company for 43 years. My father developed that recipe with fresh Chesapeake blue crab, hand-picked shell fragments removed by hand. The recipe is not a cost center. It is the reason people drive to Virginia Beach. I recommend rejecting the substitution. The room was quiet. The CFO looked at Niles. Niles looked at me. And for the first time in our 44-year overlapping history, his 44 years as founder, my 20 as employee, my father's 16 as chef, Niles Fontaine did not have the final word on the food. The substitution is tabled, Niles said. We'll revisit in Q4. It will not be revisited in Q4, or Q1, or ever. Because Ezra Crew's recipe is Ezra Crew's recipe, and his son is now at the table to make sure it stays that way. I have not sold a single share. Corinna has advised me that the shares are my leverage. The moment I sell, I lose influence. So I hold the way my father held, the way my mother held after him. Patiently, steadily. $25 at a time. The Crews are holders. We don't sell what we've built. I went to the original restaurant last week. Fontaine's on the Chesapeake. I hadn't been there since I was fired. I walked in, sat at the bar, and ordered the she crab soup. The same soup my father developed in 1982. The same recipe, unchanged, served in the same kind of bowl, with the same fresh Chesapeake blue crab that a CFO had tried to replace with canned, at a restaurant that bears the wrong name. The bartender didn't recognize me. Why would he? I was the operations VP, not the founder. My name was never on the menu. My face was never on the wall. But my father's soup was in the bowl, and my father's shares were in the account, and my father's son was on the board, and the recipe was still fresh crab, not canned, because the man at the board table had said no the way his father would have said no, quietly, firmly, with the authority of someone who understands the food better than the man whose name is on the building. The name on the building says Fontaine, but the name on the shares says Crew. And shares don't come down when you repaint the sign. I finished the soup. It was perfect. 43 years and it was still perfect. Because Ezra Crew didn't build recipes that expire. He built recipes that last. The way he built an investment. The way he built a son. I paid for the soup. Left a tip that was larger than the meal because the server was 22 and working a double and probably making what my father made in 1982, adjusted for inflation, which means she was making less. I walked out of the restaurant that my father built and that his son now partially owns, into the Virginia Beach evening, where the Chesapeake Bay was doing what it always does, carrying things forward, steadily, without hurrying, the way $25 a month carries a family from a kitchen to a boardroom over the course of 40 years. My father never got his equity from Niles Fontaine. He got something better. He got it himself, and so did I. My father bought 50-cent shares with $25 a month because a man broke a promise. He did it for 40 years. My mother continued for 23 more after he died. They never told me. They just kept buying. And the company that cheated him and fired me is now partially owned by the family it wronged. If someone owes you something and won't pay, don't wait. Don't beg. Don't stand behind them in photographs hoping they'll notice. Start buying. Start building. Start doing what Ezra Crew did in 1985 with $500 in a savings account and the patience to let 40 years do the math. The name on the building can say whatever it wants. The name on the shares is what matters. Subscribe. The next story is already compounding.